Judging by this audience, I'm having flashbacks. So there's a number of my old political economy professors in the audience, so this feels like a verbal exam, which I am guaranteed to fail, so I have to be very careful. But I'm really interested. I'm probably not going to talk for half an hour. I'm aiming for 20 minutes because I'd rather really have a good Q&A on both my sordid analysis of capitalism and Labor's broader agenda for this election, to be frank, because I think that's, well, quite frankly, from my end, that's more enjoyable, is to actually hear your views and answer your questions. I'm going to start by saying, while we're not in a crash, we're certainly in an economic crisis. And I think it's a crisis that's testing certainly the core beliefs of mainstream economists. It's one of those sort of generational shifts. If you think about the history of economic thought, the depression and the failure of sort of classical economics to respond to the depression led to the rise of Keynesianism, which obviously was the dominant economic theory in some form or another for a good 40 or 50 years, until stagflation confounded the conventional Keynesian responses. Then you had the rise of monetarism, and then sort of neoclassical liberal economics, a concentration on microeconomic reform, and a focus, a complete confidence in the 3 Ps of population, participation and productivity as the drivers of economic growth in the world, and in Australia in particular. And we're really at an inflection point again. I'm not going to provide, and I don't have the capacity to provide, a fundamental critique of capitalism in all its forms, but what I'm particularly focused on is how do progressive economists, sort of mainstream progressive economists for want of a better word, really deal with this shift in the economy, the shift in economic situation, the sort of real contradiction with what traditional slightly left of centre economic thinkers would say is how you solve these problems. Because we've got a huge crisis which sort of people like Larry Summers are referring to as secular stagnation. And I think that's probably the closest analysis of what we've got. So people are familiar with what secular stagnation means? No, I'll spend a couple of minutes doing it. So we had stagflation in the 70s, which was high unemployment and high inflation. And that destroyed sort of mainstream Keynesian thought, because the views there were you could either have high unemployment or high inflation, you couldn't have both coexisting. Now we've got a situation where we've got very low inflation, we've got very low wage growth, but we've also got very low interest rates at the same time. And in fact, across the Eurozone and Japan, you've had negative real interest rates. I.e., if you put your money in the bank, you would lose value compared to what you started with. And that's really where we are now. We've got global growth amongst OECD nations has declined from a long-term average of 3% to only 1.5% since the global financial crisis, and the OECD only a few weeks ago cut their forward projections again by 0.5% to 1%. So that's a very dramatic decline in their forecasts of what the world is going to do in terms of growth. We've got the gains from technical progress slowing. You no longer have those sort of step changes in technology that bring prosperity to certain groups of people. Inequality is rising. We're the most unequal in Australia since just before World War II. And that's bad for growth, let alone the human misery that causes. It's bad for growth. Even that sort of most orthodox of international organisations, the IMF, has found that when the top 20% of the economy increase their share of the economy, i.e. the rich get richer, that reduces your medium-term growth projections, whereas if you attack inequality and the bottom 20% gain in their share, that increases economic growth. But we've got at the moment increasing inequality, which is bad for growth. You've got education levels plateauing, and you've got an ageing population in most of the developed world. And so you've really got this secular stagnation around the world. And in Australia, you've got an even great, to add on to that challenge, you've got 1.8 million Australians who are either out of work who want more work. And for the first time in the history of the Australian capitalist economy, more than 50% of workers who have a job aren't in full-time jobs that pay leave entitlements like sick leave, annual leave, long service leave. So even if you have a job, more than 50% of those jobs are insecure. That is a market change from what we obviously saw post-World War II. And that's really confounding policymakers in terms of how do you actually avoid an economic crash, how do you actually get the economy growing again, how do you actually look after the bottom 80% in the economy, because you can't cut interest rates, which is obviously the response that has got us through our most recent crises. Obviously, the GFC was a classic example. You can't cut interest rates to get past this crisis. And that's really what's driving a lot of people, is what's the other solution? Some people say you've got to build inflation expectations, you've actually got to talk up the risk of inflation, but that seems, I think, pretty unlikely. But I think the answer's staring us in the face right now, which is you've got to tackle the wage crisis, you've got to tackle the inequality crisis, you've got to tackle insufficient demand in the economy. That is the key cause of this crisis. We just do not have enough demand in the economy. And that gives rise to a pretty controversial agenda, although I think the majority of Australian people support that agenda. And it's about government actually spending money. Spending money even if they have to borrow it, because we need that injection into the economy. We need what's called that money to go to low and middle income earners who have what's called a high marginal propensity to consume. They spend every dollar they get, and therefore when you give them tax cuts, when you lift their wages, they will spend every dollar, and that will start circulating in the economy. But that requires a government to be very active and very brave, and that's a real challenge. And it also requires a government to rewrite the industrial relations agenda in this country, because at the moment, if you blindfolded a sort of neoclassical economist and said that the official unemployment rate would have a 4 in front of it, they would be saying, well, we've got a wages breakout happening. Wages will be going through the roof. But real wages are actually flat at best, if not going backwards. Something is actually fundamentally broken in our industrial relations system. And so a key part of a response to the secular stagnation must be attacking industrial relations reforms, must be giving workers greater bargaining power, and must be giving unions greater power. But there are deeper challenges, because obviously the Uberisation of the economy, which, let's be frank, like you can cast it in all sorts of techno-babble you want. It's just another version of the Hungry Mile. It's just a digital Hungry Mile rather than wharfies out in Piedmont lining up to see who gets work for the day. But that does pose a challenge to traditional organising. And when I speak to young people, a lot of them just aren't familiar with the concept of unions. Unions are foreign to them. And so while we need to give unions more power in the workplace, I do worry that that won't be enough. And so we need to think of other things we can do in workplaces to really address this issue of bargaining power and getting wages growth increasing. One thing that is essentially pattern bargaining. Enterprise bargaining in this country has failed. We are in the OECD amongst a tiny minority that bargain at an enterprise level rather than industry level, and that is a huge constraint on employee power, and quite frankly, there's a huge constraint on good employers doing the right thing. If you're a cleaning company, you actually want to pay your workers above the award, you last in business for about 2 minutes before you get undercut by someone paying the award or even illegal wages. So we need to return to pattern bargaining of some form to rebalance the playing field. We need to increase infrastructure investment quite massively in this country, in infrastructure that actually has a real benefit to the vast majority of people rather than boondoggles for the National Party in rural areas. We have to target inequality, and we can't, there's no point, and I think this is one of the challenges as a left-wing MP in a party that seeks to form government, there's no point having policies that ostensibly are aimed at tackling inequality on this side if other fundamental economic policies on this side exacerbate inequality. You need a whole of government approach to inequality, and you need to, I think, really litigate a different understanding of how capitalism works in Australia. And that's a challenge, because I don't know who has the answer. It's easy to ask the question, but I'm not sure who has the answer to that. But they're the sort of the key three things that I think: increased demand in the economy, tackle industrial relations and bargaining power, target inequality. And if you can do all three of those things, and most importantly stay in power long enough to embed those changes into the government structure so that society embraces them, then we can change this country. Medicare is an example of how if the whole government had lost power in 84 or 87, we wouldn't have Medicare today. And so that is essential to this new economic agenda. And we really need to be brave. And I think the Australian people really want us to be brave on these issues. I think they're sick of the mainstream political parties just talking about productivity or participation or population. I think they really understand that the economy is not working for them. And when they go home every day, and the number of people who have 2 jobs is at a record high, I think they understand that the current economic system isn't working for them, and they want a government that's actually prepared to try something different. I've got the honour of representing a seat that, besides having lots of coal mining, power production, manufacturing industries in it, so it's very much a traditional electorate in terms of its industrial base. On my southern border, there's a polling place that had the highest One Nation vote outside of Queensland. Highest One Nation vote outside of Queensland. And the people there that voted for One Nation, they're not small business owners who are reactionary, they're not white supremacists, they are Anglo working class people who would have been Labor voters until the late 80s, who saw globalisation, saw themselves as the victims of globalisation, saw the Hawke-Keating reforms, believed that the Hawke-Keating reforms hurt them, and given the fact that the Hawke-Keating reforms, while they did lots of good things, did engineer a transfer of $300 billion of wealth from the bottom 60% of the economy to the top 20% of the economy. These are the sort of people who feel very isolated. They're the people that are attracted to people like Pauline Hanson and even Clive Palmer, God help us. And that's part of the economic narrative that is really important. My great political heroes are people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a great populist, and he understood you could be a great populist with progressive economic policies, because they appealed to the small, in that language at that time, the small man, the farmers, the small business owners, the manufacturing workers, African Americans entering cities for the northern cities for the first time. So I think there's a huge economic opportunity to be brave on the economic agenda, and I'm really interested in Q&A because I'm going to be slightly controversial and actually say that Labor's economic agenda, I think, is the most progressive put forward by the Labor Party since 1972. And I'm not expecting everyone to agree with that. And people may say, well, you're still aiming low by using that time frame. But it is, if you think about what we're tackling, we've got the most progressive trade policy enunciated by the Labor Party since 72. Now the challenge is to actually enforce it. That is always a challenge with Labor trade policy, and I acknowledge that. But if you look at our platform and you look at our stated policy, it is a wholesale rejection of sort of neoliberal trade policy. If you look at what we want to do around the taxation system, it's a very significant a proposal which will raise $200 billion, but it's not so much about the money being raised, it's about changing the taxation system, who gets rewarded for what sort of behaviour. If you look at what we're doing around industrial relations, it is incredibly interventionist in a positive way in terms of levelling the playing field. If you look at climate change, leaving aside targets and the importance of that, accompanying this climate change policy is the most significant industry development policy, I think, certainly since Chifley's focus on building the automotive industry in this country. So I think we do have a very progressive agenda. We probably don't have a overarching narrative about what has gone wrong in capitalism, and I think you'll never see that probably in a Labor Party, given the constituent strains within the party that work together most of the time but sometimes clash. But I think if you look at our concrete policies, you will see an incredibly progressive agenda that really tries to rebalance capitalism in this country and embrace some of the lessons. Now, it doesn't have the romanticism of AOC's Green New Deal, no. I don't pretend it does, but it's more developed than a 12-page congressional resolution. And so I think it is something that really will help us tackle the next economic crisis, or the economic crisis that we're facing right now. It's a policy approach that fundamentally questions core elements of neo-conventional economic thought about how capitalism works in this country. And I think it's a really good opportunity to show that the Australian people actually are mostly left-wing on economic policies. They want an activist government. They want a government that tackles inequality. They want a government that tackles the fundamental economic structures of this country. And I'll finish on an anecdote around public perception about these issues. There was a big exercise around talking to traditional Liberal voters and Labor voters about inequality and generosity. So there was a test where they gave people $1 and they said you could keep the $1 or you could donate it to a charity. More Liberal voters donated the $1 to charity than Labor voters. So the thesis is that Liberal voters aren't less generous than Labor voters, or aren't less generous than progressive people. But the key part of this test, and the reason I bring it up, is that they talk to the Liberal voters about attitudes to government activism around redistribution of wealth. And they benchmarked it at the start of the process. They then explained to these Liberal voters where they actually sat in terms of the income distribution in this country. And when they realised that typically they were above the median, well above the median, that they were much better off than most people in Australia, they actually then supported redistributive policies much more than at the start of the process. So why do I tell this anecdote at the end of this? Because it gives me hope that if we can educate people about what the real nature of the economy is, what the real structure of the economy is, and what people's place are in it, then we can build a groundswell of support for a progressive, redistributive economic approach from the Commonwealth. And that gives me heart and optimism, because given the state of federal politics at the moment, you have to try and be optimistic, otherwise you just won't last very long. So I'm sorry I've rabbited on a bit all over the place, but it's such a big issue that I thought it'd be better just to pick out some key points in the debate rather than give you a manifesto, because I think that probably isn't worth the paper it's written on. So thank you for indulging me this evening.